Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in today's webinar. My name is Tatsushi Arai. I am an associate professor of peace and conflict studies at Kent State University. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting today in this very important time. We're witnessing the unspeakable human suffering unfolding in Israel and Gaza, which adds to the long and growing list of ongoing destructive conflicts in Ukraine-Russia relations, Nagorno-Karabakh, Sudan, Western Sahel, and indeed throughout the world. Though our panelists and I do not intend to offer any concrete solutions to any of those ongoing challenges, we share a commitment and aspiration to further strengthen and expanding the field of peace research and practice in order to create a greater impact on these and other pressing issues. In this respect, I'd like to wholeheartedly welcome each and every one of you to join this virtual circle of learning, exchange, and reflection, hoping that everyone can take something meaningful from this panel. The title of this panel is Functional Coexistence in Conflict-Affected Societies, a decades-long view of conflict non-resolution. This event is jointly sponsored by the School of Peace and Conflict Studies of Kent State University at the Center for Peacemaking Practice, which is at Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. And for your information, this title of the panel is a working title for a planned book in contract with Routledge, which an 8-person international team of peace-building scholar practitioners are now working to develop. So what is going to happen today is that first I will share a broad overview of the theory of functional coexistence and its implications for a conflict intervention with a small case study of the Taiwan Strait based on my own ongoing practice. Then I'm going to introduce Mr. Roger McGuinty, who is a professor in defense, development, and diplomacy at Durham University. Dr. McGuinty has made significant contribution to our field through his groundbreaking work in the interaction between top-down and bottom-up approaches to peacemaking, including through his recent book, Everyday Peace. He will be presenting on Northern Ireland case study with a focus on enduring functional coexistence. And having said that, Dr. McGuinty has just received a book award. And for that reason, he is now attending the ceremony and in a seminar for the book award. However, he sent us a recorded presentation, so we're going to share his recording. And our next presenter is going to be Dr. Susan Allen. He is a Henry Hart Rice Chair and Professor of Conflict Resolution, Analysis and Resolution, and the Director of the Center for Peacemaking Practice at George Mason University's Carter School. Dr. Allen is a distinguished scholar practitioner of international peacemaking with a long-standing experience in Southern Caucasus, while making important contributions to other parts of the world. And I want to just highlight a very important recent book, Interactive Peacemaking, a People-Centered Approach. Dr. Allen will present on a long-term approaches to peacemaking, expanding our understanding of the temporal dimension of the functional coexistence approach. And finally, we will have Dr. Margarita Tadevosyan. She is the executive director of the Center for Peacemaking Practice, as well as research assistant professor of conflict resolution at George Mason University's Carter School. Dr. Tadevosyan is an accomplished scholar practitioner of conflict resolution with an extensive experience in the South Caucasus and in the former Soviet Union region. She's currently writing a book on local peace building while co-editing the planned volume on functional coexistence together with me. Her presentation will focus on the implications of functional coexistence for program evaluation, policy making, and funding. And we will take questions toward the end. You're welcome to use the chat box to raise questions throughout, but it is equally welcome to start raising hands or writing your questions in a chat box. So with this framework of discussion, allow me first to begin with my own presentation. So my presentation is titled Functional Coexistence and Its Implications for a Decades-Long Perspective of Conflict Intervention. And before I say anything, I want to just disclose my identity as a long-term peace-building practitioner. For instance, from 2007 to 2009, I spent 3 summers in Israel-Palestine, meeting, for instance, with Hamas youth wing members and Hamas leaders, running workshops in Israel and Palestine. And on one occasion, I had a deep conversation with a Hamas leader about my ongoing work on the Taiwan Strait. And that conversation pushed me to think about the question of non-resolution of conflict from a long-term perspective. Subsequently, I had an opportunity to do a series of training workshops with Syrians and Lebanese, mainly in Lebanon, but occasionally in Turkey, during the civil war. And this notion of functional coexistence we're going to talk about today was formulated to a large extent through my conversation with Syrians, though today I won't be able to get into the details about Syria or Lebanon. But I at least wanted to say that there is a very practical journey, a personal journey involved in the formulation of the theory. Now I will speak more as an academician here. So first, I would like to just define the focus and significance of the inquiry. In the field of peace and conflict studies, there is arguably a tension between 2 trends of thought. Number one is the search for a common ground for resolution. Second is the new trend to think about how to stay constructively engaged in an enduring state of conflict non-resolution. I've been engaged in Myanmar since 2013, showing the photos I took from the Rohingya and the Rakhine camps in Western Myanmar. If we seek a common ground, we'll be having those 2 circles and finding the common place. So on the left side, you see the Rohingya IDP camp that is receiving a huge amount of goods from the Rakhine side, the opposing side. Is it a common ground situation, or is it outside common ground, which appears to be supported by the Rohingya people and the Rakhine people who say that do not seek common ground for us? It is dehumanizing for us. So out of these practical contexts, I struggled a lot about what would be the position upon which I stand in terms of how to build a relationship, or maybe not to build a relationship even. And I got the hint from a scholar, Bernard Meyer, who defined the concept of enduring conflict. And I'm presenting the interwoven roots, the picture of the interwoven roots, and quote Bernard Meyer. he says, enduring conflict is that aspect of a dispute that is embedded in structures, systems, values, or identity, and will therefore not be resolved through a short-term, resolution-oriented conflict interventions. Enduring conflict is long-lasting because of its nature, not because of ineffective or inappropriate efforts to resolve it. Until the roots of the conflict change, the system evolves, or the identity or value-based elements are profoundly transformed. The conflict will remain, although how it is manifested may vary over time. And I thought about Mayer's quote a lot, because this really fits into so many contexts that I saw from the Middle East to Asia. And I decided, based mainly on my work in the Taiwan Strait, what I saw in inside Palestine, among other places, to articulate this whole notion of functional coexistence. Simply put, functional coexistence is a paradoxical state, as well as an intersection of enduring negative peace, which means sustained absence of physical direct violence on the one hand, and a state of mutual denial or non-recognition on the other hand. And if there is a situation of mutual denial, it is likely to push toward violence, but there are so many contexts where those two seemingly contradictory conditions coexist, not for 1 year or 2 years, but for decades. Now, when I say denial or non-resolution, meaning that there's an existential element, what do we deny? What do we choose not to recognize? It can be the statehood. It can be the group identity as a whole. It can be a signature policy. It can be a position taken by one party against the other, and so on and so forth. So the definition of denial and non-recognition is quite broad to accommodate for a broad range of situations. Just to kind of cultivate an intuitive sense of the context in which functional coexistence exists or is potentially applicable. I am thinking about Northern Ireland, Bosnia, Cyprus, North and South Korea relations in relation to the United States, Syria with respect to Arab-Kurdish relations, for example, Taliban-Washington relations, Rohingya-Rakhine-Burma relations, and potentially India-Pakistan over Kashmir. And maybe in some years from today, semblance of functional coexistence becomes quite important, thinking of Russia-Ukraine-NATO relations. So I want to emphasize potential, but I think you get the sense of what context I have in mind when I say functional coexistence. Now, how does functional coexistence work? I'm going to just share at least one example briefly, based on the last 2 decades of my dialogue work with Taiwanese, mainland Chinese, and American civil society delegates. What you see on this screen is a Cartesian space, X and Y. On the Y-axis, you see the range between more informal and more formal. More formal means that the relationship is institutionalized and structured. It is following a certain mandate. Then on the on the X-axis, you see the range between more individual-oriented, more collective-oriented. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that in some relational spaces, individuals have the agency, they will act according to their volition. In some other aspects of relationship building, it is the collectivities, such as states and nations, that would act. In relation to the Taiwan Strait, which has been evolving in terms of a conflict since the 1940s, despite the unchanging reality of non-recognition, with respect to Beijing's view of Taipei, there are so many shifts that happen across this two-dimensional space. Just to point out one thing, in 1992, the two sides are said to have come up with a loose consensus called the 1992 consensus, which loosely acknowledges the existence of one China with different interpretations. Based on that interpretation, the two sides started administrative meetings in Singapore in 1993 for technical reasons, not for political negotiation. But that culminated in 2010, a de facto free trade agreement, absolutely impossible in the 1940s or 50s, that even became a basis for the first cross-strait summit in 2015. Now, those of us who are familiar with the cross-strait relations will know that today's cross-strait relations is severe, dangerous, and all the rest of the negative attributes I can add. Having said that, from a decades-long perspective within the realm of non-recognition, there are so many shifts that took place. So as you see on the screen, I call these shifts shifting boundaries of mutual non-recognition. Why is this important? Because it challenges our intuitive sense of stuckness with conflict. In fact, what appears to be stuck in the context of non-resolution is not stuck. It is very dynamic. Then the question is, if we know those situations of decades-long non-resolution are actually dynamic, is there any way we can find strategic opportunities to engage with the context of non-resolution with the eventual ultimate goal of a push or some sort of peacemaking? Then quickly, I'm going to just draw 4 implications of the functional coexistence theory for practice. First is the importance of developing those actors, policymakers and civil society actors and self-conscious conflict parties, self-awareness of the historical consciousness of those shifting boundaries of mutually acceptable conflict behavior. It's not totally stuck. Second, these actors can choose to find a constructive way of staying engaged in the enduring state of conflict non-resolution. In other words, do not give up simply because it is unresolved. Stay engaged. Third, cultivate multi-layered structured perspective on conflict intervention while resisting the inertia of hegemonic stability and submissive inaction. This is to say that functional coexistence is not party A, party B relationship only. There is a pyramid, the layers of structure, top to bottom. So be aware of that. That structure pushes people to be submissive, to be hopeless, take non-action as a de facto option, default option. But overcome that is basically the basic message. And finally, make use of short-term actions to foster long-term conditions for long-term systemic change. I'm going to just elaborate a little bit on the last point. If we take any short-term actions within the context of non-resolution with existential characteristics, what we can do is short-term projects, 6 months, 1 year, because the future is unpredictable. And it could be a marginal socioeconomic or cultural project, not about the political negotiation. But this illustration shows, can we do those initiatives to envision some sort of long term? Can we do so mindful of the structural context of informal, formal, individual, collective? I hope I gave you some sketch of the theory of functional coexistence. So I'm going to just end this presentation and pass the microphone symbolically over to Roger McGuinty, who is going to do a case study of Northern Ireland. So please bear with me for just setting up the recording of the McGuinty presentation.
Hello, my name is Roger McGuinty. I'm a professor at Durham University in England. I'm very pleased to talk to you, to receive the invitation from Margarita and Tats, and I want to congratulate them on the traction that the notion of functional coexistence has had. I'm very sorry that I'm not here in person, as bad fortune would have it. I'm traveling at precisely the moment this session is being held. I've been asked to say a few words about Northern Ireland and functional coexistence. As you probably know, Northern Ireland had a major peace accord 25 years ago. Since then, there has been no return to violence, and there have been many improvements in daily life, not least in terms of the demilitarization of society. But at the same time, life is stuck in many ways. There has been no push from a major peace accord towards reconciliation or indeed conflict transformation. And there's a quotation I want to read from some research that myself and colleagues have been carrying out in Northern Ireland. And it's an interview with someone in Derry, the second city in Northern Ireland. And he says, "The violence has stopped. I don't think much else has changed, if I'm being completely honest. We're still out in our own enclaves. We don't mix. Our children don't mix," which is a bit frustrating just 25 years on from the Good Friday Agreement. Now, Northern Ireland is functional. It is part of Western Europe, albeit suffering because of suicidal Brexit. There has been no major return to violence. Public services continue to operate, although are declining. And certain levels and protocols of intergroup behavior and encounter are regularized. Intergroup encounter is, in the main, completely peaceful. At the same time, Northern Ireland is a dysfunctional society. And I have an argument in my head about whether Northern Ireland is a case of functional coexistence or dysfunctional coexistence. The power sharing assembly set up under the Good Friday Agreement is not in operation because of a massive lack of trust between political elites. It has not been in operation for 45% of the time since the Good Friday Agreement was reached. People vote along identity lines, and elite level politics is utterly toxic. So Northern Ireland is simultaneously functional and dysfunctional. For the middle classes, for example, it's functional. Life is good. But others are trapped in enclaves. They're trapped in particular patterns of lack of access to resources or lack of access to the knowledge economy. So it's more functional for some than for others. So let me finish with 4 points, 4 really quick points. The first is, I think it's worth unpacking what we mean by functionality and dysfunctionality in relation to coexistence, and whether we can really call a place in which there is massive division functional if that division is unaddressed. It's worth unpacking the notion of functional coexistence, or indeed dysfunctional coexistence, in relation to power and intersectionality. Because for some people, that society is more functional than for others. And that's going to be affected by issues of class, gender, ability, etc. The third point is, how do we move from here a little that a lot of the literature on agonistic peace is, in a sense, agnostic about the effects of conflict, that it's happy with or content or neutral on the issue of negative peace. it is very negative. It has a lot of obvious effects on quality of life, etc. I'm not saying that we shouldn't bank and celebrate the gains under negative peace, but I think we must always be pushing that dial. And my final point is to ask if functional peace or dysfunctional peace is actually built into how peace is made at the elite level. Because if we think of the peace processes of the 1990s and early 2000s, they were all about inclusion, and they were all about making sure that veto holders were included. And one can understand the reasons for that. Without them, peace is not going to be made. At the same time, that strategy reinforced and legitimized these actors who operated along identity lines. In other words, the nature of making peace perpetuated the division that was at the root cause of the conflict. So again, I'm really sorry that I can't be there in person. I'm sure it's a wonderful debate, and I hope to catch up with everyone in person at some stage in the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you. So Suzanne?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And really stimulating discussions thus far. So thank you, Tats. And I will be emailing Roger to thank him for his comments, particularly the comment that functional more for some than for others. Very helpful insight. So I will not be sharing any slides. I have some comments to make. I'm just checking my time here. Okay. And speaking then about the kind of long-term approaches to peacemaking, and I wanted to look at ways we've been, as a field, the practice of peacemaking work has over the previous decades developed an approach of incremental peace work and the long-term nature of peace work. So we've heard about whole generations working towards peace and building gradually towards peace, that it is not a quick signature on a ceasefire document that leads to all-out peace, but rather the positive peace building takes time. So here I want to build on Tats's presentation and Roger's also, Roger McGinty's also, and speak about decades-long peacemaking initiatives that have evolved and emerged over the last half century, because we do have a historical precedent for taking our time about building peace. There's empirical support for the feasibility of social processes developing over several decades that are applying the ideas of functional society, coexistence, even with the non-recognition. And I think that we've had experiences sometimes with non-recognition and denial, and then other times just with very cold, poor relationships, but yet managing to have functional coexistence, whether or not there's the recognition aspect. So recognizing kind of the definition here of functional coexistence as defined by Tats, that we're talking about non-recognition, but also I think we can learn some lessons from places where there was some recognition, but still very poor relationships. So I've engaged for over 25 years now in the South Caucasus region. Before that, in the 1980s, I was an American who thought, why are we in this Cold War with the Soviet Union? And there was this long-term Cold War. And I thought, aren't there people there that we could connect with? And so I was part of citizen diplomacy, part of this kind of people-to-people connections. And that was a long-term process that built relationships, whether it was, between specialists in particular areas of medicine, connecting around the world with other specialists, and that included Soviet and American specialists, or whether it was youth, like myself in the 1980s, it was youth connecting with other youth. And so we have this history of people-to-people contact, even when the governments have very poor relations. In the South Caucasus, there's several examples of places where there was actually the non-recognition, and still, for some periods of time, some functional coexistence. And I think particularly about the relationship between the Georgian and Abkhaz communities and the Georgian and South Ossetian communities. I will not refer to the experience of Nagorno-Karabakh as functional at the moment, unfortunately. But looking at the Georgian Abkhaz and the Georgian Ossetian relationships, there have been some things that have functioned for, as Roger McGinty told us, more functioning for some than for others, but there have been quite a few aspects of society that have functioned for people living on both sides of those divides, yet there is entirely non-recognition from the Georgian side of the Abkhaz or of the South Ossetians. This is a place that there has been a series of various peace efforts over more than two decades now. And here we have examples then of the conflicts are long-term, and so are the peace processes. There's been track 2 diplomacy, meaning that unofficial people from both sides connect and look at aspects of the peace process. There's been track 1.5 diplomacy, meaning that officials from each side connect, but in an unofficial environment where they're more able to do more creative brainstorming, speak off the record, explore options. And then, of course, there's been the official peace processes. Here, there's been the Geneva International discussions in these particular cases, and UN, OSCE, and various governments connected to that official peace process. There's also been people-to-people connections where people from both sides have been able to connect, some through family connections, others through youth programs or particular specialists, environmentalists connecting, or psychologists connecting, or journalists connecting, etc. And so what's emerged is a multi-track set of connections across this divide, so that while at the official level, there's this non-recognition, the Georgians do not recognize Abkhazia or South Ossetia. Georgians, the Georgian government sees these entities as part of territorial integrity of Georgia, yet there are so many various interactions and connections that a lot of function of society has managed to continue, even within each society and then across that divide as well. Children can go to schools generally, they can get basic health care, they can access the kinds of functions that are necessary. And there have even been some collaborations across these divides on basic services, such as irrigation water, electricity. There's a huge hydroelectric power plant, the Inguri GES, that provides electricity to people in Abkhazia, people in the Georgian-controlled territory, and also some in Russia too. So it's a very complex arrangement, but lots of functionality there in terms of electricity. There's been some cooperation about ambulances crossing a ceasefire line quickly under emergency situations. So these are examples of ways the functioning has been part of people's existence, the coexistence, even with denial and non-recognition of the other entity. There are also, I guess I could go through kind of other examples if we think about, what's happened over the last, 80 years. If we look at the last 70 years anyway, going back to, post World War II, there's been examples of really long-term work to rebuild relationships. So going from the European coal and steel community to then the European Economic Community and the various communities to lead up to the European Union, that there was not that connectedness immediately after World War II. It took time to develop that. And so I want to say that this concept of functional coexistence helps us see that in the absence of recognition, in the absence of a full peace agreement, there are still situations that are better or worse in terms of their impact on people. And negative peace is better than all-out fighting. A very slow, gradual, incremental building of positive peace is better than all-out fighting. Coexistence with some functionality is better than no peace process at all. And it's good to have that along the way while we're building a positive peace, taking steps towards the long-term peace. This is then coming from a perspective that, as Roger McGinty said, functional more or less, depending on who we're talking about, right? So some parts of society find it more functional than others. And so what I call this is a people-centered approach, that when we look at the impact of a conflict situation and of a peace process on people, we see a way of assessing, how's the peace going is based on how it's working for people. And so taking a people-centered approach in contrast to, looking at kind of the power structures and the political structures and the military aspects, but just look at how is it working for people. There, I think we can see functional coexistence offers quite a lot, certainly in contrast to the wars we see happening in around the world today. Functional coexistence would be a preferred state for most of the people living in these contexts. So I wanted to mention, and I'll put it in the chat here, I wanted to mention a book that I have, this only goes to hosts, I can't, there we go. This is a book where I write a lot more about the particular Georgian South Ossetian discussion that I mentioned. And it has the people-centered approach. And the reason I'm putting it in the chat is because it is available open access. So if you want to read more, it's an open access book. And then I also just want to mention that, and this will be my final comment, is that we do here at the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, we teach a lot of this people-centered approach. And for those who are interested in learning more, lots of opportunities, and no matter where you are in the world, we do have lots of opportunities to look at this approach with online seminars, etc. So encourage folks to check out for more examples of that too. And I think I'm right on time, Tats. Thank you.
Yeah. Rita?
Thank you. And I have the privilege and a difficult task of being last on the panel. So I will be shifting gears a little bit in what I will be discussing. And this relates to what this new approach, new framework of functional coexistence and thinking about long-term engagement and decades-long engagement in conflict resolution work means for program monitoring and evaluation and learning, but also what are some implications for policy changes and funding, because we all know that for good or for bad, a lot of peace building work is externally funded work, and the way that we work in the field also has implications to how much this work looks appealing for policymakers and how much funding is allocated to carrying out these activities. As Tats has mentioned earlier in his implications, outlined the 4 implications of functional coexistence. I want to kind of pick up from that and say that these 4 points actually are giving us a very different framework of talking about evaluation of peace building work. I'm not sure how familiar you are, but within the peace building field, we are very much focused on the evaluation metrics that exist with outputs, indicators, outcomes, and impact level. That when most of the work is guided by the theory of change that is outlining usually the interveners' long-term vision and logic of how specific intervention will lead to desired change. And the key element in the development of the of the theories of change is based on our understanding of eventual positive peace, because within the field we are framing the work that we're doing as eventually incrementally, but still contributing to the positive peace. So what does the accepting the enduring nature of functional coexistence and negative peace means for our vision of developing evaluation, theory of change and evaluation logic approach to this peace building interventions. One thing that I want to say that it completely changes the way that we are viewing and defining success. To preface this, I want to say defining success of peace building has been a daunting task. I mean, there has been a lot of writing around it, and there has been, this is an ongoing conversation, how we define success, how we measure success, what type of evidence and indicators we're using. To mention, at Carter School, we have Better Evidence Project that is precisely looking at how to gather and assess and evaluate the evidence about peace building success. And it's with the wide variety of conflict context, changing geopolitics, different types of intervention, different organizational approaches, different practitioner approaches that come into play, under having the unified understanding what success is in peace building is obviously a very difficult task. However, I think with the introduction of the functional coexistence approach and having functional coexistence as a framework of reference, with an emphasis on long-term non-resolution, it allows us to have a more pragmatic approach to evaluating peace-building programming, and understanding that some of the elements that or implications that Tats has identified, it allows to have different points of reference. Also, building on what Susan said, long-term incremental approaches and decades-long engagement allows us to not only be constructively engaged in a state of non-resolution, pushing for incremental changes, but it also, that long-term engagement provides for more space for local practitioners and local voices, help us shape the understanding of success, help us shape the evaluation process, and have that input from the local communities and local practitioners who are living and are the product of this the conflict context. So I think with the understanding of long-term and decades-long engagement comes also the space where we can build our evaluation more strongly on participatory, meaningful, real participatory approaches of the local communities that we are engaging in. It helps to, again, shape the program evaluation. It also helps to shape our understanding and learning about peace building work and how incremental approaches and long-term approaches are working by building on our understanding. And as one of our colleagues, as Tat mentioned, we're doing this book project, has said, it also allows to avoid false narratives in terms of where we're no longer reporting on specific indicators that are within a specific matrix, but we are in a way co-creating the indicators with our partners in the field, and those become free of outside evaluation and more locally owned and with a local meaning and understanding. And as kind of following up on that, the long-term approaches also with this functional coexistence view in mind also allows us to have a space to talk about failure. And I can't emphasize enough how much in the peace building work precisely because of its dependence on the funding, there is no constructive, open, and honest space where we can, in the evaluation process, talk about the failure. But because we are constrained with the projects that are 1 or 2 years long, sometimes even 6 months long, and within that, we are very much encouraged to speak about the positive dynamics that we are seeing. However, the long-term view, and specifically, again, the emphasis on negative peace and non-resolution, provides us with, as practitioners, for a space to talk about the failure, learn from the failure in a constructive way, and also help the field to learn, not only as practitioners, but also field to learn from that. So I think that's a very important perspective that, or lens that functional coexistence framework allows us to apply. One other thing that I want to mention is that we have a different intervention logic in the functional coexistence approach that is not solely focused on measurable outcomes as a study, as a full kind of product. It focuses on creating and enabling conditions that may or may not lead to positive peace at the end. And however, it allows us to, if the conditions and other conditions align, then we can talk about the functional shifts in the structures of the conflict that can lead to the resolution of the conflict. It is also important to underline that we are here talking with the evaluation process. We're talking about not having peaceful resolution of the conflict as an impact level outcome. And I think that frees up not only discursive, but also practitioner space for us in our intervention process, and also in our learning process from our intervention. By having the ability to not explicitly claim positive peace as a final impact outcome, we simultaneously have the space for the trial and error, for incremental changes to our intervention, to a space to respond to the need on the ground as we're going, without being afraid that we are not adhering to this high level standard of transforming the conflict systems. And again, functional coexistence does not advocate for the transformation of the conflict system, but it's talking about creating enabling conditions which may or may not lead to those transformations. And as Susan said, negative peace is better than straight out fighting and suffering, and also smaller changes over the time are better than stagnation and kind of constant conflict process. And two other things that I want to mention, how we can think about evaluation, because again, evaluation, we're not inventing a new process. We're just reshaping or adding an additional lens to existing evaluation approaches. So one thing that in terms of how we measure it and what type of indicators that we are bringing in or introducing in this case to the field would be one thing that I found very applicable and potentially transformative as we're talking about evaluation, is one of the implications of functional coexistence that Todd has mentioned, which is the changing awareness, the changes in the historical awareness about acceptable conflict behavior. So things that were not acceptable, as the decades-long view allows us to trace those changes, and having that as an indicator for the intervention will actually allow us to follow a process and to understand if there are some type of systemic shifts happening on the ground. What is the impact of our intervention? So I think the changing the development of historical awareness by the parties themselves and their manifestation within the social and political life would be an indicator that would help us to measure functional coexistence anchored interventions. And another indicator that kind of ties the conventional ways of thinking about evaluation and what functional coexistence brings in is how do we think about long-term, short-term alignment. So do short-term action that we see in a programmatic approach aligns with the long-term vision? I think that's could be a very good indicator that would allow us to also overcome one of the major difficulties in the peace building work, which is the fragmented nature of programmatic interventions. So even though we can have a shorter programs, because this is how policy and funding work is structured, at the same time, if those short-term programmatic interventions are placed on the continuum of a long-term vision with decades long view, that helps us to kind of overcome that siloed work that often is happening on the ground. So I think that's this kind of added value and the lens that the functional coexistence brings to our understanding and thinking about the program evaluation. And very quick as I finish, I want to say, what is the implication of this for policy and funding? Again, it helps us by not focusing at the impact level outcome. This type of evaluation can help us to engage with more pragmatic and honest conversations with funders and policymakers, advocating for longer-term engagements, advocating and showing that incremental change in a way that does not take away from the incredible, difficult work that peace practitioners are doing everywhere, and also will help us to reshape our conversations about the success and failure in particular, and will create a space where we can honestly talk about what worked and what doesn't without the fear of being penalized of not delivering, quote unquote, what we have promised in our project proposals. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're going to shift gears toward questions and answers. With Roger McGinty's permission and encouragement, I'm sharing Roger's email address, inviting those of you who want to ask Roger to actually address those questions directly to Roger, please. And I also added an open access article to functional coexistence underneath in the chat. So you're most welcome to raise any questions, any aspect of what we said, either in the chat box, so please raise your hands, or hand-raising function if you so wish. Yes, please, Natasha.
Hi. Natasha Cole, University of Westminster. So thank you very much for this really interesting discussion, and of course really timely. And I also wanted to say I deeply appreciate all of your long-standing engagements with the field and with the actual people, arenas of conflict that you talk about. I personally work on Kashmir, so that's which is my entry point into this. So, but the whole point about kind of these kinds of entrenched, enduring territorial conflicts, there's just so many ways to look at it. And I'm always often struck by how the different places we get to if we look at this from peace and conflict studies perspective, as opposed to political science work on territorial conflict. They lead to almost two different, it's as if you would be studying two different things when the object of study is really the same. So that's just a reflection. So my question really is actually a semantic one. I can see why you've called it functional coexistence. And I was looking through at the article, the link to the article that you shared, the way in which the concept of functionality, in other words, to indicate that there is something that goes on in spite of the conflict. But I wonder why not call it, for instance, I'm sorry for the provocative question, but why not call it dysfunctional coexistence? You know what I mean? What I'm trying to say is that calling it functional may naturalize or normalize certain aspects of the fact that actually there is a state of dysfunctionality that we can't escape from. And as Roger pointed out, different people are affected in different ways, but no one's completely immune from it. So I just want you to reflect a bit more. I understand the need for functional, but I think if it's the coexistence aspect that we want to emphasize and draw attention simultaneously to the difficulties, then why isn't it dysfunctional coexistence? Thank you.
Maybe I should take on this question if you don't mind, Susan and Margarita. I actually did think about this functional coexistence, and it was more of a toinkos, between functional coexistence and dysfunctional coexistence. So when Roger talked about functionality, dysfunctionality, you see, he gets it, and I was very impressed by that. Just as I was really impressed by Natasha, your very sharp comment, really appreciate. At the end, I actually came to land on functional coexistence because it becomes a good contrast to compassionate, harmonious, positive peace-oriented coexistence. And it's a mere functionality of the state of affairs falling short of active ongoing fighting up to a genocidal project. And those are the examples I see in what I chose to refer to as functional coexistence. But I actually don't have any principled opposition to calling it dysfunctional coexistence. It makes a lot of sense. So maybe we can even have a hyphen.
Thank you.
Functional coexistence. Margarita and Susan. Margarita, please.
Well, I think Susan was first, but I'll very quickly say that's a very good point. And I want to, again, encourage once this volume comes out, I think one of our authors who is talking about the Greece, conflict in Cyprus, she also raises the issue of like along the lines, as you said, functionality and dysfunctionality, and how because it is functional, a lot of times conflict parties would default to that, and there would not be an urgency of trying to resolve the conflict because it is functional enough for them to be comfortable with it. And but I think another aspect, as Todd said, it is functional enough for us to be able to have the space of staying constructively engaged. Again, I do see your point. It is, we should be calling it dysfunctional to make it uncomfortable for us to try to change it. I totally understand, but I want to say that I think the concept itself does not, the framework itself does not assume a positivity within the concept itself. If that kind of answer some of your question.
Yeah.
I just want to highlight, thank you, Natasha, for the opening to your question where you mentioned kind of it's almost as though the political science perspective and the peacemaking perspective are looking at two different things. And I think that's what I am trying to highlight with the people-centered approach idea compared to the kind of state-centered approach idea on the political status-centered approach. And I think it is useful for us to talk between those two approaches and then also to have depth work within each approach too. So thank you for highlighting that part. I think that the functional coexistence really tries to speak to both approaches and is unique in being well-rooted in both approaches.
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful question. That's I really appreciate. Anybody else, please? Dr. Neil Cooper.
Hiya, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Right. So I just want to kind of, I guess, carry on this discussion about functional and dysfunctional coexistence. And two thoughts occurred. I mean, one is that I think the phrase, there's two ways in which one can understand the phrase functional coexistence. One is as a kind of analytical description of a state of affairs, and then the second is as a kind of normative goal, right? And so I think in terms of the first version, right, analytical description of a state of affairs, I wonder whether, at least notionally, there is the divide between functional and dysfunctional is maybe there is something there to tease out around, what the potentials are, in that particular, in the context of a particular, process of coexistence, whether the kind of movement contains potentials for progress towards a more positive peace, right? Or whether, which might be a form of functional coexistence, or whether the functional coexistence is merely freezing, either freezing all sorts of inequalities and injustices at the state of non-war, or whether it's actually free, kind of like perpetuating conditions that are more likely to cause a reversion back to war. So that's one thought that I had. And then the other thing is I guess it seems to me that there's a discussion about functional coexistence as a normative goal, right? Because again, and that seems to me, whether you would want that as a normative goal perhaps depends on where you set out, right? So if there is an active war going on somewhere, then perhaps the kind of first goal is dysfunctional coexistence, because that's a state of non-war. But as a kind of long-term normative goal, perhaps the aim is actually to move from coexistence to some kind of positive peace. So those are just some thoughts that I had.
Brilliant. I think we as panelists, especially Margarita and I, discuss a lot about this connection and distinction between the analytical aspect and normative aspect. In our volume, as well as in our subsequent discussions, we make a distinction between functional coexistence as an analytic concept and a functional coexistence approach to conflict intervention and peacemaking on the other. The latter is a normative one. So you may recall that toward the end of my presentation, I articulated 4 implications. Those implications are meant to say that analytically and empirically, we understand the state of functional coexistence. That's for decades. East-West German relations in the my writing, as well as the Taiwan Strait, those are empirical examples. Those are not normative examples. But then the question is, if we have a historical consciousness, awareness of those things that have been functional for a generation or two, what does that awareness tell us about potential opportunities to engage in the ongoing situation? So that gets into a normative, and the normative is what we call a functional coexistence approach to conflict intervention and peacemaking. We make a distinction because I think we are all scholar practitioners who get together, all of us very interested in practice. We almost habitually think of practice. What does it really mean for our ongoing work? So that is really a passion that brings Susan, Margarita, myself, and others together. And then the normative engagement is part and parcel of our conceptualization. Having said that, as Margarita said very, very clearly, we are not taking any utopian thinking of a push for positive peace. In Rakhine State of Myanmar, in Syria, I have seen enough of the people who are so upset when either myself or anybody mentions the terms peace, reconciliation, conflict transformation. They got angry. It is so utopian as to be irrelevant, so disrespectful for the dignity and suffering we have. So on one day, actually, in one of those workshops back in the 1910s, I actually was asked, it was sort of within the UN framework, I was asked to introduce reconciliation. And then there was an uproar among the Syrians. And I decided to say, okay, set aside this whole notion of reconciliation that I was asked to talk about. By the way, there is this notion of functional coexistence I'm not prepared to talk about, but I'm going to just share, see what happens. So just to finish up, it is actually the Syrians who pushed me to really think about functional coexistence, both from an empirical point of view and normative point of view. And my realization really coincides with the sharp distinction you just made. Really appreciate. And Margarita, do you want to say something on it?
No, I was going to answer try to address the question that came in the chat. How do organizations that allow multiple countries to connect, like UN, contribute to functional existence? Do they help or hurt? I mean, I want to say I personally, as a practitioner, do not believe in kind of one thing fits all, and that one organization can be helpful all the time and can be dysfunctional all the time. I think it all depends on the context. But what I want to say, based from the logic and the underlying thinking within the functional coexistence, I think that multi-country organizations like UN or like OSCE, even though they are bound by incredible bureaucratic hurdles, I think their mere size and different countries that can take the lead will have a potential of helping functional coexistence in terms of staying prolonged engaged in a conflict context. Maybe one year it's the one country is taking the lead and the other one is working behind the scenes and so on and so forth. But I see the potential of multi-country and multilateral organizations to have the capacity of staying engaged for longer periods of time. Again, with a caveat that there is a bureaucratic hurdle. There is a lot of, like, for organizations like OSCE and UN, there is a lot of political back game that goes into it that determines their focus, their priorities. But in essence, I feel that at least they have the structural capacity for being engaged in a conflict context for a long period of time.
Mm-hmm. And to add to that, I think within the US government and elsewhere, I see some emergence of the long-term funding that permits the multi-year engagement. So to me, the first point is to launch this idea of functional coexistence, emphasizing that conflict resolution transformation is still desirable. We're never denying resolution and transformation. We want that. But then when that doesn't happen, the state of non-resolution persists, people abandon any investment, any engagement, and people suffer in those contexts. So it is that suffering that prompted us to define the notion of coexistence, give a name to the context of non-resolution, and find a framework in which a meaningful engagement takes place. So to answer, to respond to Lilian's question, the first step, in my view, is to launch this idea of functional coexistence as complementary to resolution, transformation, peacemaking, peace processes, and say in contexts where what seems to be a frozen situation of resolution persists, can we introduce the matrix of functional coexistence in line with what Margarita said? So that would be perhaps my supplement to what Margarita mentioned. Is there anybody who still wishes to raise questions? Most welcome. So we're gonna just close the conversation. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. It was a pleasure having you. And I sincerely hope that everybody took something meaningful out of the conversation and put that into some sort of thinking, some sort of context that would make us exceedingly happy. That's it. Okay, bye-bye, everyone.